poetic material, we may think first of places like the Psalms, or of books even like Lamentations or whatever. But the reality is, you've got little snippets of poetry in Genesis. So it's again a category that reaches pretty far. So most scholars will suggest that roughly 1/3 of the entirety of Old Testament Scripture unfolds in Hebrew poetry. Yeah. But it's just embedded in so many of the other genre forms that it doesn't seem that. So it's like, I'm trying to remember the exact percentage of Old Testament Scripture that's considered to be narrative. But, if it's, at least half, and 1/3 of the Bible's narrative. I mean, narrative and poetry cover an awful lot. So if you're going to think in this class about how do I get really the most bang for my buck in terms of working with the genre categories that I just really need to be good at if I'm going to preach from the Old Testament, narrative and poetry just carry a lot of freight. So if you're going to handle Hebrew poetry well, what do you need to be able to do? What skill sets do you need? Well, one thing, if you know much about Hebrew poetry at all, just to draw back on your experiences with the good Dr. Mandolin playing Mark Zeese. You've got to work with parallelism. The relationship between those lines. Sometimes two lines, one working in relationship to the next, sometimes two groups of two lines working in relationship to each other, but you've got to work with parallelism. Which largely means figuring out how the second part relates to the first part. Does the second line mostly reinforce the first? Which technically is synonymous parallelism. Does it contrast with the first? Antithetical parallelism. Or does it in some way really expand or build upon the first? Now, scholars argue over, and many scholars contend, that there's no such thing as purely synonymous parallelism. That the second line's never just purely repeating and reinforcing the first. That the second line always, in some way at least, slightly expands upon the first. But that discussion is really terms of what we need to talk about in here. At least, here's what you need to remember. When you deal with Hebrew poetic text, you need to keep your Mark Zeiss notes close by, or your Mark Zeiss course textbooks close by, and make sure as you work through those texts that you understand the nature of the various parallel relationships as you move through there. Because it's one of the most frequent trademark characteristics of Hebrew parallelism. Remember that when we think, or of poetry rather, when we think poetry, we think of a rhythm of sounds. But in Hebrew poetry, it is more a rhythm of meaning than it is a rhythm of sound, as these two lines sort of dance around with one another. So making sure you really get a good handle on the various types of parallel relationship. And then exploring what parts of those two lines relate to each other. So if I'm in Jeremiah 31, verse 34, which you might be for your for I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. These are roughly synonymous. The interpretive question is, are these relatively synonymous? That's the decision you're going to have to make. You can see that these are pretty much in the same category. The question is, are these? Is remember reinforcing forgive so that remember is essentially translated forgive? Or is remember expanding upon the idea of forgiveness to make a more dramatic statement about the implications, the results of forgiveness? Now, I could get to preaching about this. Here I am, just trying to lecture on Hebrew parallelism. I could get to preaching about this. Because most of us have been taught somehow through sermons that God is omniscient except in this one way. Because you've all seen the dramas, you know, where someone's shackled with a heavy burden. Shackled with a heavy burden. And bringing it, and, you know, and saying to Jesus, well, you know, and Jesus going, you know, in the skits going, what? I don't know what you're talking about. What are you even talking about? Okay? See, I don't buy that. I think this helps us understand what is meant by this. I think there's two possibilities here. One is that this term is to be taken literally as actual forgetfulness. The second is this, that it is to be taken figuratively or forensically. See if I can. Which is to say, treated let me as in what we sometimes say in English, well, we'll just forget about that.
Yeah.
See, sometimes even in class, when I'll talk about this, because I used to teach the book of Hebrews, and it's cited in Hebrews chapter 8, Jeremiah 31 is, you'll have to deal with that if you're going to preach from this passage. And sometimes when I say to students, I think you've got to understand this in light of this. As reinforcing this, sure, it's possible that the term remember can be translated with the idea of, I no longer remember what you're talking about. But even we use the word, the language of forgetting in a figurative sense. To say, we'll just forget about that. It's not going to be a barrier to the relationship. We've dealt with it. I'm not communicating this very clearly. It's not going very polished on the camera. But do you see what I'm saying there? Gammy, you see what I'm saying there? See, it preaches really well to say that God no longer remembers my forgiven sin. I kind of have an issue with that over here. And I have an issue even with biblical, and part of where it comes into play is that we're not just talking, Austin, we're not just talking here about theology. We're not just talking here about theory. Because God's forgiveness of us then becomes what? How does God's forgiveness help us in relationship to one another? How does that impact our relationships with one another? Yeah, I mean, God becomes the model, the standard, the definer of what forgiveness is, doesn't he? So, forgive others as God in Christ has forgiven you. Ephesians 4:32, that's Bible stuff right there. That's in the Bible. Forgive others as God in Christ has forgiven you. Now wait a minute. If this means this, that's a game changer. And I've heard that preached, my brothers. This is a preaching class. I'm going to talk about preaching then. I have heard this preached because I have heard it said, if you haven't forgotten, you haven't forgiven. You heard that preached?
Yeah.
I've heard that preached. You haven't forgotten, you haven't forgiven. And so people point to things like this and to the example of God and say, if you haven't forgotten, you haven't forgiven. All right, I'm not going to mess around. It's 5:48. We've only got so long to talk tonight. So the way my brother Joe Harvey puts this, we're just going to boil this down to gravy.
Yeah.
You ever heard Joe say that?
Yeah.
All right, mention to him that I worked it into class. Because he taught me that phrase at lunch. He taught me that phrase a couple days ago. So use it. Okay. Let's just get right down to it here, boys. Well-meaning preachers, by taking the surface reading of the text and not paying attention to Hebrew poetic parallels, they intend to do a good thing. But frankly, if you can actually say out loud things like, if you haven't forgotten, you haven't forgiven, you've got a pretty weak view of what some people have to forgive. I'm going to mess around. We're going to get straight to it here. Are you really going to stand up on a Sunday morning and tell someone in your congregation who has experienced sexual abuse that if you haven't forgotten, you haven't forgiven? That's criminal. Someone who made a decision at an age where they were too young to be making the decision, and they make the decision to terminate the life of an unborn child. Because they face pressure from the other party in that transaction. And they're bitter about it. They've struggled with it for years. They've struggled not only to forgive themselves, but to forgive the other participants.